Jonah Reeves never expected much from life, so inheriting his great-aunt Miriam's cabin in the secluded Hollow Pines felt like both a gift and a curse. The call about her passing had come with little fanfare, just the announcement that he was now the owner of a modest property. The cabin wasn't much, but it was somewhere to escape, and after years of relentless city noise and failed attempts to find his footing, Jonah welcomed the quiet. It helped that the woods surrounding the cabin, however, were anything but inviting. Thick pines loomed over the narrow dirt road, and the air carried an unnatural stillness, as if the forest held its breath. When Jonah arrived, dusk was settling, and the cabin looked like it hadn't seen care in decades. Moss crawled up its wooden exterior, shingles sagged on the roof, and the windows were clouded with grime. Inside, it was cluttered but oddly purposeful, as though Miriam had lived in a world of secrets she tried to preserve. The shelves were packed with books on folklore and obscure rituals, jars of herbs and powders, and old maps of the forest. A mirror above the fireplace caught Jonah's attention. Its frame was carved with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. He felt an unexplainable chill, but shrugged it off, blaming the drafty cabin. The first 2 days passed uneventfully as Jonah cleaned, repaired, and tried to make the place livable. His evenings were spent flipping through Miriam's books and deciphering the cryptic notes scrawled in the margins. They made little sense, mentioning watchers and protection rights, but Jonah dismissed them as the ramblings of an eccentric old woman. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he glanced out the window, the trees seemed closer, their shadows longer. On the third evening, the weather shifted. Clouds rolled in thick and dark, blotting out the stars as a cold wind howled through the forest. Jonah had planned to fish at the nearby stream, but when his phone, barely clinging to a signal, flashed a storm warning, he decided to stay in. The storm came quickly, rain hammering the roof and lightning splitting the sky in sharp flashes. Thunder rumbled so hard it felt like the cabin might come apart. Jonah lit a lantern and sat by the window, absently flipping through one of Miriam's journals. Then, during a particularly bright flash of lightning, he saw it. A figure stumbling through the forest. He blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him, but another flash confirmed it. Someone was out there, limping through the storm, their silhouette small and frail against the towering pines. Without thinking, Jonah grabbed his jacket and boots, cursing the rain as it soaked him instantly. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the storm. The figure didn't respond, their movements slow and uneven. Jonah pushed through the mud, his heart racing. When he finally reached them, he saw it was a young woman, her clothes torn and soaked, her face pale as death. She collapsed into his arms. He carried her back to the cabin, her body cold and trembling. Inside, he wrapped her in a blanket and tried to get her to speak, but she only stared at him with wide gray eyes filled with fear. "Where did you come from?" he asked, but she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the window. Jonah felt a shiver crawl up his spine, a sense that whatever she was running from hadn't stayed. The storm raged on, relentless, as Jonah tried to make sense of the situation. The young woman, barely out of her teens, refused to speak. She shivered under the blanket he'd draped over her shoulders, her gray eyes darting to the cabin's windows as though expecting something, or someone, to appear. Jonah's questions met only silence. Frustration crept into his voice. "Look, I can't help you if you don't tell me what's going on. Are you hurt? Lost?" Her hands trembled as she clutched the blanket tighter, finally whispering a single word. "Safe?" Jonah frowned. Safe from what? She didn't answer. Instead, her head snapped toward the door as a gust of wind rattled it violently, the sound reverberating through the small cabin. She flinched, and Jonah could see the terror etched into her face. Her fear was contagious. He checked the locks on the door and windows, trying to reassure himself that they were secure, even as unease twisted in his gut. After a while, the girl's trembling subsided, and she drifted into a fitful sleep on the couch. Jonah used the opportunity to study her more closely. Mud streaked her face, and her dark hair was matted from the rain. Her clothes, though soaked and torn, appeared strangely old-fashioned, as if they belonged to another era. Something metallic glinted at her neck, a delicate pendant shaped like a crescent moon. Jonah's curiosity got the better of him. As quietly as possible, he flipped through one of Miriam's journals. The pages were filled with bizarre accounts of shadowy figures in the woods, cryptic warnings about hunters and diagrams of protective symbols that matched the carvings on the mirror above the fireplace. One passage caught his eye. They move with the storm, hidden in the dark. They hunt the strayed and the lost. Light keeps them at bay, but only for so long. A chill crept up Jonah's spine. The girl had shown up during the storm, and now he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just running from something. She was being hunted. The wind outside shifted, carrying with it a low, guttural noise that set Jonah's teeth on edge. It wasn't the storm, he was sure of that. He peered out the window, but the rain obscured everything beyond a few feet. Still, he felt eyes watching him from the darkness. A sudden sound behind him made him jump. The girl had bolted upright, her eyes wide with panic. "Don't look outside," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah froze, his hand hovering over the curtain he'd been about to pull back. "Why? What's out there?" "They'll see you," she said, her voice trembling. "If they see you, they'll come." Before Jonah could respond, a loud knock echoed through the cabin. It was deliberate, slow, and impossibly heavy, like a giant's fist pounding on the door. The girl's breathing quickened. "Turn off the lights," she whispered, her face pale. "It's already too late." The cabin plunged into darkness as Jonah switched off the lights, his heart pounding in his chest. The girl huddled against the far wall, her gray eyes glinting faintly in the shadows. Outside, the pounding on the door grew louder, each knock reverberating through the small space. Jonah grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter and motioned for the girl to stay quiet. "Up there," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "They're not human," she replied, her voice trembling. "They come with the storms. Always watching, always hunting." Her cryptic words sent a chill down Jonah's spine. He gripped the flashlight tightly and crept toward the door, his every instinct screaming at him to stay back. He pressed his ear against the wood, trying to discern any sound beyond the relentless rain. For a moment there was nothing but silence, and then a guttural growl broke through the noise, low and menacing. Jonah staggered back, his blood running cold. "They know I'm here," the girl whispered from behind him. "They can smell me." "They smell you?" Jonah turned, confused and increasingly terrified. "What are they?" The girl hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she said, "Shadows. They take forms. Beasts, humans, things in between. They feed on fear, on those who wander too far from safety." Jonah's pulse quickened. Her words sounded insane, but the primal terror he felt was undeniable. Another knock shook the door, harder this time. The old wood creaked under the force, and Jonah knew it wouldn't hold much longer. "We need to run," the girl said suddenly, standing up. Her fear had transformed into resolve, her small frame straightening as she looked toward the back of the cabin. "There's another way out." Jonah grabbed her arm. "No way. Running in this storm? That's suicide." "Staying is worse," she shot back, her voice firm. "They won't stop." The growling outside intensified, and Jonah's grip on her arm loosened. He knew she was right. With no other option, he grabbed a coat, his flashlight, and the hunting knife from the kitchen. The girl led him to a narrow hatch hidden beneath a threadbare rug. Jonah hadn't even known it was there. She pulled it open, revealing a tunnel that descended into the earth. "Miriam didn't mention this," Jonah muttered as they climbed down. "She wouldn't have," the girl replied cryptically. "Not unless she trusted you." Jonah's flashlight flickered as they descended, the damp air thick with an earthy stench. The tunnel walls were lined with strange symbols carved into the dirt, symbols that matched the ones in Miriam's journals. Jonah didn't have time to question them. A deafening crash echoed above, and a monstrous howl filled the cabin. "They're inside," the girl whispered, her voice shaking. Jonah sealed the hatch behind them, plunging the tunnel into near darkness. His heart raced as the sound of heavy footsteps and guttural growls filled the space above. Whatever was up there was no longer hunting. It had found its prey. The tunnel stretched deep into the earth, its damp walls narrowing as Jonah and the girl pushed forward. Jonah's flashlight wavered, the weak beam barely illuminating the path ahead. The girl, her bare feet moving soundlessly, seemed to know the way, her steps confident despite the oppressive darkness. "Where does this lead?" Jonah asked, his voice a low murmur. A place they can't follow, she replied, her tone sharp yet weary. It's old. Older than them. Her cryptic answer unsettled him further, but he didn't press. The air grew colder as they descended, the chill biting at Jonah's exposed skin. Every sound, their footfalls, the faint drip of water, felt amplified, echoing unnaturally in the confined space. Behind them, distant thuds reverberated, followed by an eerie, guttural growl. Whatever was above the cabin was searching. "Why are they after you?" Jonah demanded, his frustration breaking through his fear. "What's so special about you?" The girl paused, her gray eyes catching the faint light as she turned to face him. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," Jonah snapped, gripping the flashlight tighter. "They may hunt those with light in their blood," she said after a pause. "People like me. We can see them for what they really are." Jonah blinked, processing her words. "You're saying you can see these things?" "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And they want to extinguish it. If they get to me, they'll grow stronger. And if they grow strong enough, they won't stop at the woods. They'll spread." A chill ran down Jonah's spine, but he shook his head. "This is insane. Shadows don't hunt people. This isn't real." She didn't argue, just turned and continued walking. Jonah followed, though doubt gnawed at his mind. The strange symbols etched into the walls grew more frequent, their sharp lines glowing faintly now, casting another worldly light that replaced his faltering flashlight. Jonah touched one of the symbols, and his fingers tingled with a faint warmth. "Don't touch those," the girl hissed, pulling him back. "They're wards. They keep the shadows out." Jonah pulled his hand back, unsettled. The symbols pulsed once, then dimmed. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. Jonah's breath caught as he stepped inside, the walls covered with more glowing symbols and ancient carvings depicting monstrous forms, beasts with jagged teeth and hollow eyes, devouring entire villages. "This place," Jonah muttered. "What is it?" "Sanctuary," she replied, her voice reverent. "It was built by those who came before us, people who fought the shadows and drove them back. The wards here are strong enough to keep them out. For now." Jonah scanned the carvings, his unease deepening. The last panel showed a figure with eyes like the girl's, standing against the darkness. "They were like you," he said. "They had the light." "Yes," she whispered, her voice heavy with sorrow. "But they all died fighting." A deep, resonant growl echoed through the tunnel behind them. Jonah's blood ran cold as the girl turned, her face pale. "They found us." The growl grew louder, a guttural rumble that reverberated through the chamber, shaking dust loose from the ancient walls. Jonah's pulse quickened as he turned to face the tunnel they had just emerged from. Shadows slithered along the ground, coiling and shifting like living things, their jagged forms visible even against the dim light of the glowing symbols. "They can't come in here," Jonah said, his voice trembling. "The wards will hold, right?" "They'll try to break them," the girl said grimly, her gray eyes fixed on the creeping darkness. "They've done it before." The shadows writhed at the chamber's edge, halted by the glowing symbols etched into the stone, but instead of retreating, they began to pool together, merging into a massive, undulating mass. Tendrils of darkness stretched forward, pressing against the barrier. The symbols pulsed weakly, flickering like dying embers. "We need to strengthen the wards," the girl said, her voice urgent. "The light in your blood, it can help." "I don't have any..." "Lie," Jonah snapped, panic rising in his chest. "I don't even know what you're talking about." "You do," she insisted, grabbing his hand and pressing it to one of the symbols. "You wouldn't have found me if you didn't." As soon as his hand touched the glowing carving, a surge of warmth shot through his palm, spreading up his arm and into his chest. The symbol flared brighter, the light spreading across the wall. The shadows recoiled, hissing in fury, but they didn't retreat entirely. Jonah stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What the hell was that? "You can strengthen the wards," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "But you have to focus." "I don't know how," Jonah shouted. "I'm not some chosen savior. This isn't me." "Then we're both dead," she said simply, turning her attention to the shadows. She stepped forward, her bare feet firm against the stone floor, and raised her hands. Her gray eyes glowed faintly, and the symbols nearest her pulsed brighter. "Do what I do," she said over her shoulder. "Trust me." Jonah hesitated, fear and doubt warring within him, but as the shadows pressed harder against the barrier, their hissing growing louder, he forced himself to act. He pressed his trembling hands to another symbol and focused, imagining the light he had felt earlier. Warmth surged again, and the symbol flared brighter. The shadows screamed, their forms flickering and breaking apart. Jonah felt the light within him grow stronger, spreading to the other symbols. The chamber blazed with brilliance, pushing the darkness back. The girl chanted something under her breath, her voice a steady rhythm that matched the pulsing light. For a moment, it seemed the shadows might retreat, but then the largest tendril surged forward, striking the barrier with a force that shook the ground. Cracks spiderwebbed through the glowing symbols, and the girl faltered, her light dimming. "Now!" Jonah roared, slamming both hands against the wall. A blinding burst of light erupted from the symbols, enveloping the chamber. The shadows shrieked one last time before disintegrating, leaving only silence. Jonah collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The girl knelt beside him, her face pale but relieved. "You didn't," she said softly. Jonah looked at her, his breath ragged. "For now, but what happens next?" She didn't answer, her gaze distant. The symbols on the walls dimmed, their light fading into a soft glow. And in the quiet, Jonah knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The chamber fell silent, the faint glow of the symbols casting a dim, otherworldly light on Jonah and the girl. Jonah's hands shook as he pressed them to his knees, his breath ragged. Every nerve in his body screamed for rest, but his mind was ablaze with unanswered questions. "What now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The girl, still pale and visibly drained, leaned against the chamber wall. Her gray eyes studied him with a mix of exhaustion and determination. "We've bought ourselves time, but the darkness doesn't give up so easily. They'll regroup." Jonah frowned, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You keep saying they. Who? What are they? And why the hell was I dragged into this?" She hesitated, the weight of the question pulling at her expression. Finally, she sank to the floor, crossing her legs as if bracing herself to tell a story too heavy to carry alone. "They're remnants," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Echoes of something ancient, born from the void between worlds. They're not just creatures. They're pieces of something bigger, trying to reform." "Reform into what?" Jonah asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "A god," she replied. "Or at least, something that once was. It was broken and scattered, but it's been clawing its way back ever since. The rituals, the sacrifices, they're all part of its plan to piece itself together." Jonah shivered despite the warmth still lingering from the wards. "And you? Where do you fit into this?" "I'm what you might call a keeper," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "My family has guarded this place for generations, keeping the pieces locked away. But something changed. The darkness grew stronger. It broke free. And now it's after you," Jonah guessed, his tone sharp with realization. "That's why it dragged me into this. You needed help." Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time she looked vulnerable. "I didn't mean to," she admitted. "But when the words failed, I had no choice. You were nearby, and I had the light," Jonah interrupted, piecing it together. "That's what you said before. What does that even mean?" She hesitated again, then looked him in the eye. "The light is rare. It's something you're born with. A connection to the other side. It's what powers the wards, what keeps the darkness at bay. My family used to have it, but I'm the last." Jonah stared at her, the enormity of her words pressing down on him. "So now what? I become your sidekick in this cosmic horror story?" "You become a choice," she said firmly. "The light in you is strong, stronger than mine. You can leave now, forget all of this, and live your life. Or you can stay and fight, knowing the darkness will never stop coming." Jonah leaned back, his mind spinning. The weight of her words settled over him, heavy and suffocating. Outside the chamber, the faint sound of wind carried a sinister whisper. "I'll fight," Jonah said finally, his voice steady despite the fear. "But I'm going to need answers, and a damn good plan." The girl nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "Then we begin." The cabin creaked under the weight of the storm, wind howling like a wounded animal outside. Jonah sat in the dim light of the lantern, the girl, now introduced as Elena, kneeling before a worn map spread across the floor. Symbols were scrawled on its surface, each one pulsing faintly with an eerie glow that seemed to resonate with the growing tension in the room. "They'll come tonight," Elena said, her voice tight with resolve. "The wards won't hold much longer. They've gathered enough strength to breach them." Jonah clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the edge of the table. "What's the plan? Because sitting here waiting to die isn't my idea of heroism." Elena looked up, her gray eyes gleaming with determination. "We fight, but not with brute strength. There's an altar deeper in the woods, older than anything you've ever seen. If we can reach it and light the Flame of Severance, it will burn away their connection to this world." Jonah stared at her, his pulse pounding in his ears. "And let me guess, the woods are crawling with those things." She nodded. "They'll try to stop us. They know what the flame can do." "Perfect," Jonah muttered, reaching for the rifle he had found in the cabin's closet earlier. He checked its chamber, despite knowing the bullets wouldn't do much. "Guess it's better than sitting here and waiting." The storm grew worse as they stepped outside, the air thick with an oppressive energy that made Jonah's skin crawl. The trees loomed like skeletal giants, their branches twisting unnaturally against the wind. Elena led the way, clutching a bundle of herbs and a small vial of glowing liquid, her last line of defense. They hadn't gone far when the first shadow emerged from the trees. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and its eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. Jonah raised the rifle, but before he could fire, Elena flung a handful of the herbs at the creature. The leaves burned as they struck it, and the thing let out a shriek that echoed through the forest before retreating into the darkness. "They hate the light," she whispered. "Keep close to me." More of the creatures appeared as they pressed on, their forms growing more grotesque with each encounter. One lunged at Jonah, its clawed hands reaching for his throat. He swung the rifle like a club, the impact knocking the thing back just long enough for Elena to douse it with the glowing liquid. The creature disintegrated with a horrifying wail. They reached the altar as the storm reached its crescendo, lightning illuminating the ancient stone covered in intricate carvings. Elena knelt, her hands trembling as she prepared the ritual. Jonah stood guard, the shadows closing in around them. "Hurry up!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Elena chanted in a language Jonah didn't understand, her voice rising with desperation. A creature broke through the circle of light, its jaws snapping inches from Jonah's face. He shoved it back, feeling his strength waning. Then, the flame ignited. A brilliant light erupted from the altar, burning through the darkness like a cleansing wave. The creatures screamed and dissolved, their forms reduced to ash as the storm abruptly ceased. Jonah fell to his knees, gasping for air as silence settled over the forest. "It's done," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "For now." Jonah looked at her, his exhaustion mingled with a flicker of hope. "What now?" She met his gaze, her expression weary but resolute. "We prepare." Because this was only the beginning. The forest was eerily silent in the aftermath, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted only moments earlier. Jonah and Elena sat on the moss-covered steps of the ancient altar, their breaths ragged and their bodies aching. The glow of the flame still lingered on the stone, casting faint shadows that danced like ghosts. Jonah wiped blood, his own or the creature's, he wasn't sure, from his brow. "So, that's it? They're gone?" "For now," Elena replied, her voice subdued. She stared into the distance, her face etched with exhaustion. "The flame severed their connection to this place, but it's not permanent. They'll find another way. They always do." Jonah exhaled sharply, running a hand through his damp hair. "Great, so we bought ourselves, what, a few months? A year?" Elena turned to him, her gray eyes weary but steadfast. "Maybe longer if we prepare. The altar was only one piece of the puzzle. There are other places like this, scattered across the world. Each one holds a fragment of the power needed to keep them at bay. Jonah groaned, leaning back against the cold stone. So now we're globe-trotting monster hunters? Fantastic. Just what I signed up for. A faint smile tugged at Elena's lips. You could always go back to your life. Pretend none of this happened. Jonah snorted. Yeah, because that's an option. I'll just explain to people why I've got nightmares of shadow monsters and why I jump at every flicker of movement. Sure, that'll work. Elena's smile faded, and she looked down at the bundle of herbs in her lap. You don't have to decide now. But I can't do this alone, Jonah. And I think you know that. The weight of her words settled heavily on him. Jonah glanced at the altar, the faint glow of the flame a reminder of what they had just survived. He thought of the cabin, the storm, the creatures that had almost killed them both. Walking away wasn't an option. Not really. Guess I'm in, he said finally, his voice tinged with resignation. Not like I've got much of a choice. Elena looked up, her expression softening. Thank you. Jonah waved her off. Don't thank me yet. I've got a feeling this is going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. They began the slow trek back to the cabin, the forest still heavy with an unnatural quiet. As they walked, Jonah noticed how Elena kept glancing over her shoulder, her body tense despite the apparent calm. You're expecting something, he said. She nodded. The severance weakens them, but it doesn't destroy them. There's always a chance one of them lingered. Shadows are persistent. Jonah tightened his grip on the rifle slung over his shoulder. Good to know. When they reached the cabin, it felt like returning to a hollow shell. The warmth was gone, the memories of what had transpired staining every corner. Jonah sat heavily on the couch, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open again. Elena stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of dawn. Get some rest, she said. We'll need to leave soon. Jonah nodded, though he doubted sleep would come. The journey ahead was uncertain, the road dark and fraught with dangers he couldn't yet comprehend, but for now, they had survived, and that was enough. The cabin stood silent as Jonah and Elena packed their meager belongings, the oppressive quiet of the forest lingering like a shadow. The events of the past days weighed heavily on them, every creak of the floorboards a stark reminder of what had transpired. Jonah felt like a trespasser in his uncle's home, its once cozy atmosphere now warped by fear and bloodshed. This place will never feel the same, Jonah muttered, shoving a flashlight into his bag. He paused, staring at the old leather-bound journal he'd taken from the altar. Its pages were filled with cryptic symbols and notes his uncle had scrawled over the years. It's like he knew. He was preparing for this, wasn't he? Elena glanced over, her expression somber. Your uncle saw the signs long before anyone else. He tried to fight them in his way, but he was only one man. The journal... It's a map, Jonah. A guide to the other altars. With it, we might stand a chance. Jonah closed the bag with a sharp tug, his jaw tight. Yeah, great, because fighting immortal shadow monsters is exactly how I plan to spend my life. Elena didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the forest beyond the window. The trees were dense, their branches gnarled and skeletal. Jonah followed her gaze, the unease gnawing at his gut returning. Something's out there, isn't it? He asked, already knowing the answer. Elena nodded. They're watching. The flame weakened them, but it didn't destroy their influence. We're still in their territory. Jonah instinctively checked the rifle leaning against the wall. He wasn't sure it would do much good, but it was better than nothing. So what's the plan? We just walk out there and hope they don't rip us apart? No, Elena said firmly, turning to face him. We move at first light. Until then, we stay inside. Together. Jonah raised an eyebrow. You think that'll stop them? It's not about stopping them, she said quietly. It's about surviving long enough to leave. The hours crawled by as they waited, the tension palpable. Jonah sat by the fire, the journal open in his lap, but the symbols and notes blurred together. His mind refused to focus, too preoccupied with the faint sounds coming from outside. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and sometimes a low, guttural noise that sent chills down his spine. Elena sat across from him, her knife resting on her knee, her posture rigid. She didn't speak, her eyes darting to the windows every time the noises grew louder. The lantern's light flickered and Jonah's chest tightened. Elena? I know, she said sharply, rising to her feet. She moved to the window, peering into the darkness. They're closer. Jonah grabbed the rifle, his palm slick with sweat. How close? Elena's voice was a whisper. Close enough. The first shadow appeared just beyond the tree line, its form indistinct but its presence undeniable. Jonah's breath hitched as more shadows joined it, their shapes writhing like smoke against the dim light of the rising moon. Stay ready, Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear etched on her face. The night's not over yet. If you are interested in the dark details of this story, please leave a comment with your thoughts. Click the like button to support, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more scary stories.